Mr. President, thank you for giving us all from the Russian media, from RT, MTV, Rossiyskaya Gazeta, First Channel, and Rossiya 24. Thank you for giving us all the opportunity to talk with you during this very critical phase of the crisis in Syria, where there are many questions that need to be addressed on where exactly the political process to achieve peace in Syria is heading, what's the latest developments on the fight against ISIL, and the status of the Russian and Syrian partnership, and of course the enormous exodus of Syrian refugees that have been dominating headlines in Europe. Now, the crisis in Syria is entering its 5th year, and you have defied all predictions by Western leaders that you would be ousted imminently, and you continue to serve today as the president of the Syrian Arab Republic. Now, there's been a lot of speculation recently caused by reports that officials from your government met with officials from the government of your adversary, Saudi Arabia, that caused speculation that the political process in Syria has entered a new phase. But then statements from Saudi Arabia that continue to insist on your departure suggest that, in fact, very little has changed despite the grave threat that groups like ISIL pose far beyond Syria's borders. So what is your position on the political process? How do you feel about power sharing and working with those groups in the opposition that continue to say publicly that there can be no political solution in Syria unless it includes your immediate departure? Have they sent you any signals that they are willing to team up with you and your government? And in addition to that, since the beginning of the crisis in Syria, many of those groups were calling for you to carry out reforms and political change. But is such change even possible now under the current circumstances with the war and the ongoing spread of terror in Syria?
Let me first divide this question. It's multi-question in one question. The first part regarding the political process. Since the beginning of the crisis, we adopted the dialogue approach. And there were many rounds of dialogue between the Syrians in Syria, in Moscow, in Geneva. But actually, the only step that has been made or achieved was in Moscow 2, not in Geneva, not in Moscow 1. And actually, it's a partial step. It's not full step, and that's natural because it's a big crisis. You cannot achieve solutions in few hours or few days, but it's a step forward, and we are waiting for Moscow 3. I think we need to continue the dialogue between the Syrians, political entities or political currents, in parallel with fighting terrorism, in order to achieve or to reach a consensus about the future of Syria. So that's what we have to continue in. If I jump to the last part, because it's related to this one, is it possible to achieve anything taking into consideration the prevailing of terrorism in Syria and in Iraq and the region in general? We have to continue dialogue in order to reach the consensus, as I said, but if you want to implement anything real, it's impossible to do anything while you have people being killed, bloodletting hasn't been stopped, people feel insecure. Let's say we sit together as Syrian political parties or power and achieve a consensus regarding something in politics, in economy, in education, in health, in everything. How can we implement it if the priority of every single Syrian citizen is to be secure? So we can achieve consensus, but we cannot implement unless we defeat the terrorism in Syria. We have to defeat terrorism, not only ISIS. I'm talking about terrorism because you have many organizations, mainly ISIS and Al-Nusra, that were announced as terrorist groups by the Security Council. So this is regarding the political process. Sharing the power, of course, we already shared it with some part of the opposition that they accepted to share it with us. A few years ago, they joined the government, although sharing the power is related to the constitution and to the elections, mainly parliamentarian elections, and of course, representation of the Syrian people by those power. But in spite of that, because of the crisis, we said, let's share it now. Let's do something, a step forward, no matter how it's practical or effective, let's say. Regarding the refugee crisis, I would say now that the Western dealing and the Western propaganda recently, during the last week, mainly during the last week, regardless of the accusation that those refugees are fleeing the Syrian government, what they call it regime, of course. Actually, it's like the West now is crying on the refugees with one eye and aiming at them with the machine gun with the second one. Because actually those refugees left Syria because of the terrorism, mainly because of the terrorists and because of the killing. And second, because of the result of terrorism. When you have terrorism, you have the destruction of the infrastructure, you won't have the basic needs of living. So many people will leave because of the terrorism and because they want to earn their living somewhere in this world. So the West is crying for them, and the West is supporting terrorists in the beginning of this crisis when it said that it was a peaceful uprising, as they called it, when they said later it's moderate opposition, and now they say there's terrorists like Al-Nusra and ISIS, but because of the Syrian state or Syrian regime or the Syrian president. So as long as they follow this propaganda, they will have more refugees. So it's not about Europe didn't accept them or inbred them as refugees. It's about not dealing with the cause. Stop, if you are worried about them, stop supporting terrorists. That's what we think regarding the crisis. This is the core of the whole issue of refugees.
Mr. President, you touched on the subject of the internal Syrian opposition in your first answer. Nevertheless, I'd like to go back to that because it's very important for Russia. What should the internal opposition do in order to cooperate and coordinate with Syrian authorities to support them in battle, which is what they say they intend to do? How do you see the prospects for the Moscow III and Geneva III conferences? Will they be useful to Syria in the current situation?
As you know, we're at war with terrorism, and this terrorism is supported by foreign powers. It means that we're in a state of complete war. I believe that any society and any patriots and any parties which truly belong to the people should unite when there is a war against an enemy, whether that enemy is in the form of domestic terrorism or foreign terrorism. If we ask any Syrian today about what they want, the first thing they would say is, we want security and safety for every person and every family. So we, as political forces, whether inside or outside the government, should unite around what the Syrian people want. That means we should first unite against terrorism. That is logical and self-evident. That's why I say that we have to unite now as political forces or government, or as armed groups which fought against the government in order to fight terrorism. This has actually happened. There are forces fighting terrorism now alongside the Syrian state, which had previously fought against the Syrian state. We have made progress in this regard, but I would like to take this opportunity to call on all forces to unite against terrorism, because it is the way to achieve the political objectives which we, as Syrians, want through dialogue and political action.
Concerning the Moscow III and Geneva III conferences, in your opinion, are there good prospects for them?
The importance of Moscow III lies in the fact that it paves the way to Geneva III, because international sponsorship for Geneva was not neutral, while Russian sponsorship is. It's not biased and is based on international law and Security Council resolutions. Second, there are substantial differences around the transitional body item in Geneva. Moscow III is required to resolve problems between different Syrian parties, and when we reach Geneva III, it will ensure a Syrian consensus which would enable talks to succeed. We believe that it would be difficult for Geneva III to succeed unless Moscow III does. That's why we support holding this round of negotiations in Moscow once preparations have been completed, particularly by Russian officials.
I would like to continue with the issue of internal cooperation in order to solve the Syrian crisis. It's clear that Iran, since solving the nuclear issue, will play a more active role in regional affairs. How would you evaluate recent Iranian initiatives on reaching a settlement for the situation in Syria? And in general, what is the importance of Tehran's support for you? Is there military support? And if so, what form does it take?
At present, there is no Iranian initiative. There are ideas or principles for an Iranian initiative based primarily on Syria's sovereignty, the decisions of the Syrian people, and on fighting terrorism. The relationship between Syria and Iran is an old one. It's over 3.5 decades old. There is an alliance based on a great degree of trust. That's why we believe that the Iranian role is important. Iran supports Syria and the Syrian people. It stands with the Syrian state politically, economically, and militarily. When we say militarily, it doesn't mean, as claimed by some in the Western media, that Iran has sent an army or armed forces to Syria. That is not true. It sends us military equipment, and of course, there is an exchange of military experts between Syria and Iran. This has always been the case, and it is natural for this cooperation to grow between the two countries in a state of war. Yes, Iranian support has been essential to support Syria in its steadfastness in this difficult and ferocious war.
Concerning regional factors and proponents, you recently talked about security coordination with Cairo in fighting terrorism, and that you are in the same battle line in this regard. How is your relationship with Cairo today, given that it hosts some opposition groups? Do you have a direct relationship, or perhaps through the Russian mediator, particularly in light of the strategic relations between Russia and Egypt? President Sisi has become a welcome guest in Moscow today.
Relations between Syria and Egypt have not ceased to exist even over the past few years, and even when the president was Mohamed Morsi, who is a member of the terrorist Muslim Brotherhood organization. Egyptian institutions insisted on maintaining a certain element of this relationship. First, because the Egyptian people are fully aware of what is happening in Syria, and second, because the battle we are fighting is practically against the same enemy. This has now become clearer to everyone. Terrorism has spread in Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, in other Arab countries, and in some Muslim countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and others. That's why I can say there is a joint vision between us and the Egyptians, but our relationship exists now on a security level. There are no political relations. I mean, there are no contacts between the Syrian Foreign Ministry and the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, for instance. Contacts are done on a security level only. We understand the pressures that might be applied on Egypt or on both Syria and Egypt, so that they don't have a strong relationship. Of course, it doesn't go through Moscow. As I said, this relationship has never ceased to exist, but we feel comfortable about improving relations between Russia and Egypt. At the same time, there are good, strong and historical relations between Moscow and Damascus, so it's natural for Russia to feel comfortable about any positive development in relations between Syria and Egypt.
Mr. President, allow me to go back to the question of fighting terrorism. How do you look at the idea of creating a region free of ISIS terrorists in the north of the country on the border with Turkey? In that context, what do you say about the indirect cooperation between the West and terrorist organizations like Al-Nusra Front and other extremist groups? And with whom are you willing to cooperate and fight against ISIS terrorists?
To say that the border with Turkey should be free of terrorism means that terrorism is allowed in other regions. That is unacceptable. Terrorism should be eradicated everywhere, and we have been calling for 3 decades for an international coalition to fight terrorism. But as for Western cooperation with the Al-Nusra Front, this is reality, because we know that Turkey supports Al-Nusra and ISIS by providing them with arms, money and volunteers. And it is well known that Turkey has close relations with the West. Erdogan and Davutoglu cannot make a single move without coordinating first with the United States and other Western countries. Al-Nusra and ISIS operate with such force in the region under Western cover, because Western states have always believed that terrorism is a card they can pull from their pocket and use from time to time. Now they want to use Al-Nusra just against ISIS, maybe because ISIS is out of control one way or another. But that doesn't mean they want to eradicate ISIS. Had they wanted to do so, they would have been able to. For us, ISIS, Al-Nusra and all similar organizations which carry weapons and kill civilians are extremist organizations. But who we conduct dialogue with is a very important question. From the start, we said that we engage in dialogue with any party if that dialogue leads to degrading terrorism and consequently achieving stability. This naturally includes the political powers, but there are also armed groups with whom we conducted dialogue and reached agreement in troubled areas, which have become quiet now. In other areas, these armed groups joined the Syrian army and are fighting by its side, and some of their members became martyrs. So we talk to everyone, except organizations I mentioned, like ISIS, Al-Nusra, and others, similar for the simple reason that these organizations base their doctrine on terrorism. They are ideological organizations and are not simply opposed to the state, as is the case with a number of armed groups. Their doctrine is based on terrorism, and consequently dialogue with such organizations cannot lead to any real result. We should fight and eradicate them completely, and talking to them is absolutely futile.
When talking about regional partners, with whom are you prepared to cooperate in fighting terrorism?
Certainly with friendly countries, particularly Russia and Iran. Also, we're cooperating with Iraq because it faces the same type of terrorism. As for other countries, we have no veto on any country provided that it has the will to fight terrorism and not, as they are doing in what is called the international coalition led by the United States. In fact, since this coalition started to operate, ISIS has expanded. In other words, the coalition has failed and has no real impact on the ground. At the same time, countries like Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Western countries which provide cover for terrorism like France, the United States, or others, cannot fight terrorism. You cannot be with and against terrorism at the same time. But if these countries decide to change their policies and realize that terrorism is like a scorpion, if you put it in your pocket it will sting you. If that happens, we have no objection to cooperating with all these countries, provided it is a real and not a fake coalition to fight terrorism.
What is the Syrian army's current condition? They've been fighting for over 4 years. Are they exhausted by the war or become stronger as a result of engagement in military operations? And are there reserve forces to support them? I also have another important question. You said a large number of former adversaries have moved to your side and are fighting within the ranks of government forces. How many? And what is the extent of their help in the fight against extremist groups?
Of course, war is bad, and any war is destructive. Any war weakens any society and any army, no matter how strong or rich a country is. But things cannot be assessed this way. War is supposed to unite society against the enemy. The army becomes the most important symbol for any society when there is aggression against the country. Society embraces the army and provides it with all the necessary support, including human resources, volunteers, conscripts, in order to defend the homeland. At the same time, war provides a great deal of expertise to any armed forces, practically and militarily. So there are always positive and negative aspects. We cannot say that the army becomes weaker or stronger, but in return, this social embrace and support for the army provides it with volunteers. So in answer to your question, are there reserves? Yes, certainly. For without such reserves, the army wouldn't have been able to stand for 4.5 years in a very tough war. Particularly since the enemy we fight today has an unlimited supply of people. We have terrorist fighters from over 80 or 90 countries today, so our enemy is enjoying enormous support in various countries from which people come here to fight alongside them. As for the army, it's almost exclusively made of Syrians, so we have reserve forces, and this is what enables us to carry on. There is also determination. We have reserves not only in terms of human power, but in will as well. We're more determined than ever before to fight and defend our country against terrorists. This is what led some fighters who used to fight against the state at the beginning, for various reasons, discovering they were wrong and decided to join the state. Now they are fighting battles along with the army, and some have actually joined as regular soldiers. Some have kept their weapons, but they are fighting in groups alongside the armed forces in different parts of Syria.
Mr. President, Russia has been fighting terrorism for over 20 years, and we have seen its different manifestations. It now seems you are fighting it head-on. In general, the world is witnessing a new form of terrorism. In the regions occupied by ISIS, they are setting up courts and administrations, and there are reports that it intends to mint its own currency. They are constructing what looks like a state. This in itself might attract new supporters from different countries. Can you explain to us whom are you fighting? Is it a large group of terrorists, or is it a new state which intends to radically redraw regional and global borders? What is ISIS today?
Of course, the terrorist ISIS groups tried to give the semblance of a state, as you said, in order to attract more volunteers who live on the dreams of the past, that there was an Islamic state acting for the sake of religion. The ideal is unreal, it's deceptive. But no state can suddenly bring a new form to any society. The state should be the product of its society. It should be the natural evolution of that society to express it. In the end, a state should be a projection of its society. You cannot bring about a state which is a different form and implant it upon a society. Here we ask the question, does ISIS, or what they call Islamic State, have any semblance to Syrian society? Certainly not. Of course we have terrorist groups, but they are not an expression of society. In Russia, you have terrorist groups today, but they do not project Russian society, nor do they have any semblance to the open and diverse Russian society. That's why if they tried to mint a currency or have stamps or passports, or have all these forms which indicate the existence of a state, it doesn't mean they actually exist as a state. First, because they're different from the people, and second, because people in those regions flee towards the real state, the Syrian state, the national state. Sometimes they fight them too. A very small minority believes these lies. They are certainly not a state, they are a terrorist group. But if we want to ask about who they are, let's speak frankly. They are the third phase of the political or ideological poison produced by the West, aimed at achieving political objectives. The first phase was the Muslim Brotherhood at the turn of the last century. The second phase was Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in order to fight the Soviet Union. And the third phase is ISIS, the Al-Nusra Front and these groups. Who are ISIS? And who are these groups? They are simply extremist products of the West.
Mr. President, at the beginning of the Syrian crisis, the Kurdish issue started to be discussed more often. Previously, Damascus was severely criticized because of its position toward the Kurdish minority. But now, practically in some areas, Kurdish formations are your allies in the fight against ISIS. Do you have a specific position towards who the Kurds are to you and who you are to them?
First, you cannot say there was a certain state policy concerning the Kurds. A state cannot discriminate between members of its population, otherwise it creates division in the country. If we had been discriminating between different components of society, the majority of these components wouldn't have supported the state now, and the country would have disintegrated from the very beginning. For us, the Kurds are part of the Syrian fabric. They're not foreigners. They live in this region like the Arabs, Circassians, Armenians, and many other ethnicities and sects who've been living in Syria for many centuries. It's not known when some of them came to this region. Without these groups, there wouldn't have been a homogeneous Syria. So, are they our allies today? No, they're patriots. But on the other hand, you cannot put all the Kurds in one category. Like any other Syrian component, there are different currents among them. They belong to different parties. There are those on the left and those on the right. There are tribes and there are different groups. So it's not objective to talk about the Kurds as one mass. There are certain Kurdish demands expressed by some parties, but there are no Kurdish demands for the Kurds. There are Kurds who are integrated fully into society. I would like to stress that they're not just allies at this stage, as some people would like to show. There are many fallen Kurdish soldiers who fought with the army, which means that they are an integral part of the society. But there are parties which had certain demands, and we addressed some at the beginning of the crisis. There are other demands which have nothing to do with the state, and which the state cannot address. There are things which would relate to the entire population, to the constitution, and the people should endorse these demands before a decision can be taken by the state. In any case, anything proposed should be in the national framework. That's why I say we are with the Kurds and with other components, all of us in alliance to fight terrorism. This is what I talked about a while ago, that we should unite in order to fight ISIS. After we defeat ISIS, Al-Nusra and the terrorists, the Kurdish demands expressed by certain parties can be discussed nationally. There's no problem with that. We do not have a veto on any demand, as long as it is within the framework of Syria's unity and the unity of the Syrian people and territory, fighting terrorism, Syrian diversity, and the freedom of this diversity in its ethnic, national, sectarian, and religious sense.
Mr. President, you partially answered this question, but I would like a more precise answer, because some Kurdish forces in Syria call for amending the constitution, for instance setting up a local administration and moving towards autonomy in the north. These statements are becoming more frequent now that the Kurds are fighting ISIS with a certain degree of success. Do you agree with such statements that the Kurds can bet on some kind of gratitude? Is it up for discussion?
When we defend our country, we do not ask people to thank us. It is our natural duty to defend our country. If they deserve thanks, then every Syrian citizen defending their country deserves as much. But I believe that defending one's country is a duty, and when you carry out your duty, you don't need thanks. But what you have said is related to the Syrian constitution. Today, if you want to change the existing structure in your country, in Russia for instance, let's say to redraw the borders of the republics, or give one republic powers different to those given to others, this has nothing to do with the president or the government. This has to do with the constitution. The president does not own the constitution, nor does the government. Only the people own the constitution, and consequently, changing it means national dialogue. For us, we don't have a problem with any demand. As a state, we do not have any objection to these issues as long as they do not infringe upon Syria's unity and diversity and the freedom of its citizens. But if there are certain groups or sections in Syria which have demands, they should be tabled within the national framework and in dialogue with Syrian political forces. When the Syrian people agree on taking steps of this kind, which have to do with federalism, autonomy, decentralization, or changing the whole political system, this needs to be agreed upon by the Syrian people, and consequently amend the constitution. This is why these groups need to convince the Syrian people of their proposals. In that respect, they're not in dialogue with the state, but rather with the people. When the Syrian people decide to move in a certain direction and to take a certain step, we will naturally approve it.
Now, the US-led coalition has been carrying out airstrikes on Syrian territory for about 1 year on the same areas that the Syrian Air Force is also striking ISIL targets. Yet there hasn't been a single incident of the US-led coalition and Syrian Air Force's activity clashing with one another. Is there any direct or indirect coordination between your government and the US coalition in the fight against ISIL?
You'll be surprised if I say no. I can tell you that my answer will be not realistic to say no while we are fighting the same, let's say, enemy. We are attacking the same target in the same area without any coordination and at the same time without any conflict. And actually this is strange, but this is reality. There's not a single coordination or contact between the Syrian government and the United States government, or between the Syrian army and the American or the US army. And this is because they cannot accept the reality that we are the only power that's fighting ISIS on the ground. For them, maybe if they cooperate with the Syrian army, this is like a recognition of our effectiveness in fighting ISIS. This is part of the willful blindness of the American administration, unfortunately.
So not even indirectly through, for example, the Kurds? Because we know that the US are working with the Kurds, and the Kurds have some contacts with the Syrian government. So not even any indirect coordination?
Not even any third party, including the Iraqis, because before they started the attack, they let us know through the Iraqis. Since then, not a single message or contact through any other party.
Okay, so just a little bit further than that, you lived in the West and you at one time moved in some of those circles with some Western leaders that since the beginning of the crisis have been backing armed groups who are fighting to see you overthrown. How would you feel about one day working again with those very same Western leaders and perhaps shaking hands with them? Would you ever be able to trust them again?
First, it's not a personal relation, it's a relation between states. And when you talk about relation between states, you don't talk about trust, you talk about mechanism. So trust is a very personal thing. You cannot depend on in political relation between, let's say, people. I mean, you're responsible for example, in Syria for 23 millions, and let's say in other country for tens of millions. You cannot put the fate of those tens of millions or maybe hundreds of millions on the trust of single person. Or two persons in two countries. So there must be mechanism. When you have mechanism, you can talk about trust in different way, not personal way. This is first. Second, the main mission of any politician or any government, any president, prime minister, doesn't matter, is to work for the interest of his people and the interest of his country. If any meeting or any handshaking with anyone in the world will bring benefit to the Syrian people, I have to do it, whether I like it or not. So it's not about me, I accept it or I like it or whatever. It's about what the added value of this step that you're going to take. So yes, we are ready whenever there's interest of the Syrians. I will do it, whatever it is.
Regarding alliances in the fight against terrorism and ISIS, President Putin called for a regional alliance to fight the so-called Islamic State, and the recent visits of Arab officials to Moscow fall into that context. But Syrian Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallem said that would need a miracle. We are talking here about security coordination, as described by Damascus, with the governments of Jordan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. How do you envisage that alliance? Will it achieve any results, in your opinion? You said that any relationship is based on interests, so you're willing to coordinate with these countries. And what is the truth behind the meetings held between Syrian and maybe Saudi officials, as reported by the media.
As for fighting terrorism, this is a big and comprehensive issue which includes cultural and economic aspects. It obviously has security and military aspects as well. In terms of prevention, all other aspects are more important than security and military. But today, in the reality we now live in terms of fighting terrorism, we're not facing terrorist groups. We are facing terrorist armies equipped with light, medium and heavy weaponry. They have billions of dollars to recruit volunteers. Military and security aspects should be given priority at this stage. So, we think this alliance should act in different areas, but to fight on the ground first. Naturally, this alliance should consist of states which believe in fighting terrorism and believe that their natural position should be against terrorism. In the current state of affairs, the person supporting terrorism cannot be the same person fighting it. This is what these states are doing now. Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Jordan, who pretend to be part of a coalition against terrorism in northern Syria, actually support it in the south, the north and the northwest, virtually in the same regions in which they are supposed to be fighting terrorism. Once again, I say that within the framework of public interest, if these states decide to go back to the right position, to return to their senses and fight terrorism, naturally, we will accept and cooperate with them and with others. We do not have a veto, and we do not stick to the past. Politics changes all the time. It might change from bad to good, and the ally might become an adversary, and the adversary an ally. This is normal. When they fight against terrorism, we will cooperate with them.
Mr. President, there's a huge wave of refugees, largely from Syria, going to Europe. Some say these people are practically lost to Syria. They're deeply unhappy with the Syrian authorities because they haven't been able to protect them and they've had to leave their homes. How do you view those people? Do you see them as part of the Syrian electorate in the future? Do you expect them to return? And the second part of the question has to do with the European sense of guilt about the displacement happening now. Do you think that Europe should feel guilty?
Any person who leaves Syria constitutes a loss to the homeland, to be sure, regardless of the position or capabilities of that person. This, of course, does not include terrorists. It includes all citizens in general, with the exception of terrorists. So yes, there is a great loss as a result of emigration. You raised a question on elections. Last year we had a presidential election in Syria, and there were many refugees in different countries, particularly in Lebanon. According to Western propaganda, they had fled the state, the oppression of the state and the killing of the state, and they are supposed to be enemies of the state. But the surprise for Westerners was that most of them voted for the president who was supposed to be killing them. That was a great blow to Western propaganda. Of course, voting has certain conditions. There should be an embassy, and to have the custodianship of the Syrian state in the voting process. That depends on relations between the states. Many countries have severed relations with Syria and closed Syrian embassies, and consequently, Syrian citizens cannot vote in those countries. They have to go to other countries where ballot boxes are installed, and that did happen last year. As for Europe, of course it's guilty. Today, Europe is trying to say that Europe feels guilty because it hasn't given money or hasn't allowed these people to immigrate legally. And that's why they came across the sea and drowned. We are sad for every innocent victim. But is the victim who drowns in the sea dearer to us than the victim killed in Syria? Are they dearer than innocent people whose heads are cut off by terrorists? Can you feel sad for a child's death in the sea and not for thousands of children who've been killed by the terrorists in Syria? And also for men, women and the elderly? These European double standards are no longer acceptable. They have been flagrantly exposed. It doesn't make sense to feel sad for the death of certain people and not for the deaths of others. The principles are the same. So Europe is responsible because it supported terrorism, as I said a short while ago, and is still supporting terrorism and providing cover for them. It still calls them moderate and categorizes them into groups, even though all these groups in Syria are extremists.
If you don't mind, I would like to go back to the question about Syria's political future. Mr. President, your opponents, whether fighting against the authorities with weapons or your political opponents, still insist that one of the most important conditions for peace is your departure from political life and as president. What do you think about that? as president and as a Syrian citizen. Are you theoretically prepared for that, if you feel it's necessary?
In addition to what you say, Western propaganda has, from the very beginning, been about the cause of the problem being the president. Why? Because they want to show that the whole problem in Syria is caused by one individual. And consequently, the natural reaction for many people is that if that person is the problem, they should not be more important than the entire homeland. So let them go, and things will be all right. That's how they oversimplify things in the West. What's happening in Syria, in this regard, is similar to what happened in your case. Notice what happened in the Western media since the coup in Ukraine. What happened? President Putin was transformed from a friend of the West to a foe, and yet again he was characterized as a Tsar. He's portrayed as a dictator suppressing opposition in Russia, and that he came to power through undemocratic means, despite the fact that he was elected in democratic elections. And the West itself acknowledged that the elections were democratic. Now it is no longer democratic. This is Western propaganda. They say that if the president goes, things will get better. What does that mean, practically? For the West, it means that as long as you are there, we will continue to support terrorism, because the Western principle followed now in Syria and Russia and other countries is changing presidents, changing states, or what they call regime change. Why? Because they do not accept partners and do not accept independent states. What is their problem with Russia? What's their problem with Syria? What's their problem with Iran? They're all independent countries. They want a certain individual to go and be replaced by someone who acts in their interests and not in the interest of his country. For us, the president comes through the people and through elections, and if he goes through the people. He doesn't go as a result of an American decision, a Security Council decision, the Geneva Conference or Geneva Communique. If the people want him to stay, he should stay, and if the people reject him, he should leave immediately. This is the principle according to which I look at the issue.
Military operations have been ongoing for more than 4 years. It's likely that you analyze things and review matters often. In your opinion, was there a crucial juncture when you realized war was unavoidable, and who initiated that war machinery? The influence of Washington or your Middle East neighbors? Or were there mistakes on your part? Are there things you regret? And if you had the opportunity to go back, would you change them?
In every state there are mistakes, and mistakes could be made every day, but they do not constitute a crucial juncture because they're ever present. So how do these mistakes bring about the situation we are living in Syria today? It doesn't make sense. You might be surprised if I tell you that the crucial juncture causing what happened in Syria is something many people wouldn't even think of. It was the Iraq War in 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq. We strongly opposed it because we knew things were moving towards social division and unrest. And we're Iraq's neighbour. At that time, we saw that the war would turn Iraq into a sectarian country, into a society divided against itself. To the west of Syria, there is another sectarian country, Lebanon. We are in the middle. We knew well that we would be affected. Consequently, the beginning of the Syrian crisis, or what happened in the beginning, was the natural result of that war and the sectarian situation in Iraq, part of which moved to Syria, and it was easy for them to incite some Syrian groups on sectarian grounds. The second point, which might be less crucial, is that the West adopted terrorism officially in Afghanistan in the early 1980s, and at that time called terrorists freedom fighters. And then in 2006, when Islamic State appeared in Iraq under American sponsorship, they didn't fight it. All these things together created the conditions for the unrest. With Western support and Gulf money, particularly from Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and with Turkish logistic support, particularly since President Erdogan belongs intellectually to the Muslim Brotherhood. Consequently, he believes that if the situation changed in Syria, Egypt and Iraq, it means the creation of a new sultanate. Not an Ottoman sultanate this time, but a sultanate for the Brotherhood, extending from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean and ruled by Erdogan. All these factors together brought matters to where we are today. Once again, I say that there were mistakes, and mistakes always create gaps and weak points, but they're not sufficient to cause this alone, and they do not justify what happened. And if these gaps and weak points are the cause, why didn't they lead to revolutions in the Gulf states, particularly in Saudi Arabia, which doesn't know anything about democracy? The answer is self-evident, I believe.
Mr. President, thank you for giving us the time and for your detailed answers to our questions. We know that in September you have your Golden Jubilee, your 50th birthday. Probably the best wishes in the current circumstances would be the return of peace and safety to your country as soon as possible. Thank you.
أنا أشكركم.